Am I audible? Yeah, right. Okay.
Loud and clear.
Okay. Then I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think that throughout their speech, they didn't tell us how exactly this is unfair, right? I think they went on telling us about how like Kamala Harris sponsoring Beyonce to promote her campaign is inherently unfair because like the Democratic Party necessarily has more money, right? We think that this doesn't change on either side of the house and it remains relatively symmetrical. Why, right? Because we think that first of all, big parties are the parties that are usually the ones that are more grounded and the ones that people usually think of when they think of the US presidential election, right? I think when you think of the US presidential election, you usually think of the big parties such as the Democrats and the Republicans, right? You don't tend to think of smaller parties such as the Green Party, such as like the Libertarian Party or whatever, right? But all these smaller parties are just like proof that they don't get as much traction anyway, right? Whether you like push them to whether you like ban to digital like advertising or not. And we think that even though yes, big parties tend to have more money, we think that it doesn't even make a change anyway, right? Because even without these big parties sponsoring influences in status quo, we think that they already have enough support in enough traction in the status quo, right? I think if we look at the fact that like most people are like damn loyal towards either side of like the political spectrum, either Democrat or Republican, right? I think that this is something that doesn't change, right? And I think secondly, these big political parties are more likely to have more news coverage in like the mainstream media, right? You see CNN and Fox News covering these big parties, right? All these big leaders and these big, big influential political like ideologies in status quo, right? So we don't think that necessarily them actually now pushing more ads in the digital sphere will now create a tangible impact, right? So we think that, okay, some pure characterization, right? We think in status quo, right? People who put out digital campaigns and advertising tend to be smaller parties and those who actually need to get more traction, right? I think this looks like a distinction between advertising, looking at bad advertising, right? We think that this is not inherently bad advertising, right? Because we think that number one, it's meant to basically serve the purpose of spreading this political message, right? There's basically you want voters to vote for you, that you want voters to know about your campaign, right? We think that this is in stark contrast to like what advertising doesn't allow in status quo, which is advertising for tobacco and alcohol, right? Because they are objectively bad for people's health, right? But we don't think that this applies to political advertising, right? Because they meant to serve to promote this certain campaign, right? And we think that there's also a big nuance to what exactly is a political campaign, right? We think that political advertising can also look like advertising not necessarily just for a certain candidate, but it also looks like advertising with very political ideology, like very political topics such as climate change, right? Such as the LGBTQ communities and like the minority rights, right? So basically we have two arguments in the speech, how we think that it infringes on the freedom of speech, right? And next, how we think that it basically promotes censorship, right? Okay, we think that first of all, political discourse already exists in status quo, right? We see that there's so many different people and so many people on TikTok and on Instagram who already talk about these political candidates without necessarily being sponsored, right? Which I think just proves the premise of how they already have this traction, how they already have this grounding, right? They don't necessarily need this advertising because people are already loyal to this party and they already know what this party is going to do, right? So we think that it is part of their right for smaller parties and for smaller campaigns to actually gain traction, right? We tell you this is useful, number one, why, right? Because we think that first of all, smaller parties don't necessarily have a lot of media attention. People don't generally know about these smaller parties and smaller candidates, right? We tell you that digital advertising is beneficial to these like smaller parties, right? Because first of all, right, it obviously democratizes advertising, right? We think that it democratizes advertising because we think that it's easier to access buying YouTube ads than getting on CNN, right? I think like those things are very, very different. And we think that secondly, it's also beneficial because you can also reach a very wide audience. You can reach a wide audience and you can also reach a targeted audience who are more likely to be in support of your campaign, right? I think we see this in TikTok with like a stark contrast in whether your feed looks like something that's very political, something that's more leaning to the right or leaning to the left, right? So we think that like big political parties already have the attention, right? Meaning that the net negative that you get on that side of the house is that smaller parties now get less attention, right? Because now you deny them the right to now advertise to a wide voter base, this voter base that they crucially need for their campaign, right? And we tell you that this is not inherently bad people, right? They're just generally smaller parties who want to gain traction in the political sphere, right? We think that the news is more likely to cover big politicians and like generally more sensational politics rather than smaller parties, right? Who might be able to serve some good for a local community, who might be able to do some good in a political sphere where both candidates are bad, right? So we think that as a whole, right, we think that when you actually ban this, you don't actually cause damage to bad parties and bigger parties necessarily, right? But we think that the biggest stakeholder that you actually affect are now voters who don't know about these smaller parties, and these smaller parties who now have no right to reach out to like the wider audience, right? And we think that secondly, it inherently censors like what is it? A lot of the political views that are actually circulating towards around the internet, right? We think that like advertising, propaganda are all something that relates and like combines that make like a political discourse, right? I don't think that it's necessary the fact that, you know, somebody puts a political ad means that they're automatically being manipulative, right? It's in their right to politicize whatever they want to do, right? Because we think that it gives the government the right now to crack down on opposition views, right? I think the fact that it's so difficult and so easy at the same time to characterize what exactly is political, what exactly is not political, automatically gives the government the right to now put any sort of ideology that is remotely political into something that's undesirable, right? So we think that political views that also include views on climate change, that also include views that actively go against the government, such as opposition parties actively campaigning against the downfalls of the government, right? We think that all of these are things that can fall into political advertising, right? We think that it's inherently censorship, because now like these views and these like all these other views in opposition, whether it be views about climate change, like whether it be views about like minority rights in a certain country, right, will now all get shifted away because now like governments and don't allow like quote unquote political advertising, right? So we think as a whole, right, we think all you're doing is mainly harming the those who are most vulnerable, right? Those who don't have enough traction and desperately need this attention on the digital like sphere, right? We think that it is censorship for a lot of political ideologies that especially are not especially widely circulated because the mainstream news media doesn't necessarily cover it, right? So as a whole, we think if you want to support freedom of speech, thanks.